Hi everyone. Thank you, Karen and Piotr, for that, and also everyone at the Centre for the Social Research in Health at UNSW for inviting me to give this talk. I was meant to be in Australia as a visiting research fellow at Archers at La Trobe, and I'm obviously not for obvious reasons. And as you can imagine, I'm very disappointed not to actually be in Australia giving this talk today. I am, however, very excited to be giving this talk over Zoom. Something I've never done before. So please do bear with me if things don't quite go as smoothly as they should. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Oh, just a little content warning. There are images of naked men in my PowerPoint. That perhaps shouldn't be surprising. So let's see how this goes. Here we go. So I'm here to talk to you today about my recently published book, Work That Body, Male Bodies in Digital Culture. The book is an attempt to make sense of, as I see it, the recent rise in different types of men using digital media to sexualize their bodies in different ways. I began research on it around 2014 as a result of my noticing a remarkable increase in the amount of images of sexualized male bodies that were circulating not only across social media platforms like Tumblr and Instagram, which is basically the subject of my book, but in popular culture more widely too. So in reality television, on magazine covers, in newspapers, as well as in fashion shows. Now, of course, men's bodies have been sexualized across mass media since the origins of photography and cinema. We need only think of a Hollywood star like Rudy Valentino. However, there seemed to be something different about this recent proliferation, not least the sheer amount of images in circulation, as well as the degree of sexualization that was taking place in both the mainstream as well as men's everyday lives. And I wanted to know why. In the process of trying to find out, I settled on 4 distinct, though overlapping case studies that seemed to exemplify this emergent cultural phenomenon, and that I came to think were best placed to make sense of it. These are the Celebrity Male Nude Leak, where full frontal images of male celebrities circulate across social media platforms and gossip blogs just before that celebrity launches a new project or just after a PR scandal. Rise of the spawnosexual, or men sharing eroticized images of their gym-fit bodies over social media. The RuPaul's Drag Race online body transformation tutorials, in which drag queens, who mostly identify as men, demonstrate the techniques to transform their bodies into the hyperbolic modes of feminine drag that are popular on the show. And finally, the rise of chemsex, when gay and bisexual men use smartphone hookup applications to organize group sex encounters where particular types of recreational drugs are consumed. My training is in cultural studies, so I approached each of these digitally mediated body practices conjuncturally and asked why they've emerged in the ways that they have at this particular moment in time, or historical conjuncture. In doing so, I arrived at the following conclusion. All of these digitally mediated male body practices emerged in the period that followed the 2008 financial crisis. This increase in different types of men using digital media to sexualize their bodies has taken place as a way of negotiating, living through the increased precarity that has been caused by the redoubling of neoliberalism. We didn't begin in 2008. The consensus in media and cultural studies is that the period that Anthony Giddens has described, has called late modernity, the 1960s onwards, represents a significant turning point. During this period, we see a marked increase in representations of sexualized male bodies in Hollywood cinema, in the mainstreaming of metropolitan gay culture, and in the visual cultures of consumerism, such as advertising, magazine, and retail space. These representations have been understood as embodied responses to social changes brought about by feminism, gay liberation, and the AIDS crisis in the context of an expanding consumer culture. Scholars argue that their emergence, particularly after the 1970s, was significant because historically the male body had been far less visible than the female body in the popular cultures of modernity. This, it has been argued, is because modern hierarchies of power have been organized according to the Cartesian privileging of the mind over the body. So this has meant that during this period, those who have held power, middle class, white, heterosexual, cisgendered men, have defined themselves through their mind, whilst at the same time defining those they have subordinated, the feminine, the queer, the working class, and those racialized as non-white, through their bodies. This has a multitude of implications. What this has meant for capitalism is that the former group has historically been employed as high-paid decision makers, whilst the latter have had their bodies exploited in low or no paid work. For example, through manual labour, domestic labour, sex work, or slavery. One aspect of this is the sexualized ways that women's bodies have been visualized in contemporary culture so as to create value for capitalism, whilst only creating limited value, whether that be economic or moral, for themselves. So if the male body has been sexualized to some degree in mainstream culture since at least the 1970s, why am I arguing that the post-2008 conjuncture represents a turning point? In terms of the case studies I explore, they either represent a quantitative intensification of the sexualized male body, or the way that the bodies have been sexualized has a conjunctural specificity that only became possible after 2008. So, going through each of them. So, celebrity penises were virtually invisible in popular culture prior to 2008. Now you're just a few clicks away from seeing scores, if not hundreds of them. As for sexualized male gym selfies, though of course men have gone to the gym for decades, my research unearthed a number of empirical indicators that showed that there has been an increase in men going to the gym for reasons of sexual desirability, as opposed to fitness or well-being over the last decade. Drag queen culture has existed in many competing iterations for hundreds of years. RuPaul's Drag Race, however, represents the high watermark of drag culture success, with even mainstream entertainment juggernaut Strictly Come Dancing, which may have a version in Australia, I'm not sure, but it's a big Saturday night television in the UK. Strictly Come Dancing using dancers, catchphrases, and judges from RuPaul's Drag Race. And finally, with regards to the chapter on chemsex, whilst gay men and other social groups have taken drugs in sexual settings, again for hundreds of years, the use of hookup apps to organise group sex encounters in private accommodation, where particular drugs are consumed, has only really emerged as a distinct sexual practice over the past decade. In what remains of this presentation, I'll outline the historical shifts that I think explain both the rise in these practices as well as giving them their conjunctural specificity. These are, as I've already said, the crisis of neoliberalism after 2008, the historical relationship that neoliberalism has had with gendered and sexualized modes of embodiment, and the role digital media has played in the extension of neoliberalism as a hegemonic project, after 2008. I'll take each of these in turn before showing how they came together in each of the case studies. I take my understanding of neoliberalism from Stuart Hall's essay, The Neoliberal Revolution. In this essay, he understands neoliberalism as a Gramscian hegemonic project that works to implement free market, competitive individualism in all areas of social life, including, for our purposes, our subjectivities and our bodies. Before I talk about neoliberal embodiment, I'll first explain what has been specific to neoliberalism, at least in the Anglo-American context, which is the context of my book, since 2008. Different forms of neoliberalism have existed globally since it became hegemonic after the 1970s. Post-2008 neoliberalism has a specificity that it helps explain the rise of the phenomenon in my book. So the post-2008 conjuncture represents a period of major crisis for neoliberalism, one whose consequences are still unraveling today. It begins with the 2007-2008 financial crisis that was triggered by the collapse of the US subprime mortgage market and resulted in a global recession. Despite being widely accepted at the time as being caused by the neoliberal deregulation of the global financial system, in the UK context, the coalition government that was elected in 2010 successfully made enough of the electorate believe that this crisis was caused by Labour's fiscal mismanagement, especially on public services. This narrative gave legitimacy to the largest programme of public service cuts since the 1980s. Thus, the economic crisis of neoliberalism was met by its ideological redoubling, a peculiar contradiction that is a key aspect of the context of the emergence of the body practices in my book. UK Prime Minister David Cameron used the term the age of austerity to characterise this ideological redoubling. Now, there's no time today to get into individual austerity policies. The most important thing about these policies was their contribution to the steep increase in inequality between social groups across different axes of power: class, gender, race, generation, able-bodiedness, and so on, with ample evidence that women, ethnic minorities, the working classes, the disabled, the young, and the elderly have borne the brunt of these new historical arrangements. Having said this, what's interesting about the so-called age of austerity, at least in terms of the argument I'm setting out, is that it also affected social groups who had previously been relatively well served by capitalism, the middle classes, and for our purposes, men. Particularly under mid-20th century social democracy, the conditions existed for even most working class men to be able to secure permanent employment and something approaching a breadwinner salary that they could support a family with, albeit with the help of an expanded welfare state. The expectation for men to be breadwinners does not change under neoliberalism, though the ability for anyone to secure anything other than precarious employment or any sort of welfare support has dramatically diminished in the post-2008 conjuncture. As Andrea Cornwall argues, the abject failure of millions of men to live up to neoliberalism's injunctions is one of the most striking features of contemporary life. So how do these historical conditions relate to modes of embodiment? According to body study scholars, bodies have registered these historical changes in different ways. The one that is most relevant to the discussion at hand is through the aesthetic labour that women in particular have been exhorted to perform in order to produce the slender, glamorous, and beautiful body, so exalted in the visual cultures of contemporary consumerism. Women have long been expected to engage in beautifying body practices, but according to the 2017 co-edited collection called Aesthetic Labour, these practices have not only proliferated, but also acquired a new intensity in a culture in which neoliberal norms and values have been re-insisted on. In this culture, these beauty practices become understood as self-authored acts of individual transformation that enable women to appreciate their human capital so they can better compete on the job market and in their intimate lives. The digital has played a pivotal role in all these post-2008 cultural shifts, in both extending neoliberal capitalism after the crisis and the modes of embodiment that have emerged as a result. In fact, you might argue that digital technologies have resuscitated capitalism as an economic system after 2008, in that they have become the cutting edge of capital accumulation in the institutions and practices of digital capitalism represented by Silicon Valley. However, digital capitalism does not only work as a technique of capital accumulation. It also significantly intersects with forms of neoliberal cultural production, sociality, subjectivity, and embodiment. For instance, Deborah Lupton has written extensively on the wearable technologies of the quantified self movement, arguing that in the way they encourage bodily self-surveillance and produce data for Silicon Valley to sell, they are neoliberal technologies of the self par excellence. And Sarah Benet-Weiser and Alison Hearn have written about how both celebrities and ordinary people are now using social media to self-brand or apply neoliberal branding strategies to intimate parts of their everyday lives, including their bodies. So it's here that the digitally mediated male body practices of my book can be located, at the conjunction of digital capitalism, post-2008 neoliberalism, and the modes of gendered and sexualized embodiment that have been potentiated therein. To summarize, since 2008, the redoubling of neoliberalism's hegemonic efforts in a post-crisis context have meant that even social groups previously well served by capitalism, in our case men, have begun to experience some of the precarious living conditions historically associated with women as well as other minorities. And just like women, one resource that some men have begun to turn to in order to negotiate living through these newly precarious times are their bodies, using the tools of digital capitalism to sexualize their bodies in an attempt to make life in the post-2008 conjuncture more livable. The men in my book do this in two ways, either to create different forms of value in an historical context where value creation has been made more difficult for everyone except global elites, or to create collective bonds during a conjuncture in which neoliberalism has re-insisted on competitive individualism as the privileged mode of being in the world. The first three case studies in the book represent different aspects of the first of these strategies. So I'll talk about the Celebrity Nude League at length shortly. Just to say here that what became clear from my research was that the majority of the men involved in these leagues worked in the reality television sector, the most neoliberalized sector in the entertainment industry, where pay is so low and working conditions so precarious that these celebrity men use any means necessary to grow their celebrity brand. This included sexualizing their bodies through these leaked images. Then there's the spawnosexual, a term that was popularized by journalist Mark Simpson in 2014 and is a portmanteau of the words sports star, porn star, and metrosexual. The term refers to a man who diets and exercises to create a lean, muscular body so that he can circulate sexualized images of it over social media. In this chapter, I interview men who engage in these practices. And not unlike the celebrities in the previous case study, these non-celebrity men spoke of the fewer opportunities they had to create value in austerity Britain. And so they turned to digitally mediating sexualized versions of their bodies to feel valuable. And the emphasis on feeling is important here because they all recognize that the actual value, economic, social, or cultural, that they created was very limited. What they received instead was short bursts of joy from seeing images of their bodies commented on, liked, or shared on their social media accounts. The next chapter in the book looks at RuPaul's Drag Race. The nature of this case study is quite clearly different to the previous two, in that the success of RuPaul's Drag Race is dependent on the opportunities for value creation afforded to a handful of drag queens, both by digital capitalism and by neoliberalism, as well as the fact that the mode of sexualization they engage in is hyperbolically feminine. Unlike the men of the previous chapters, drag queens have always had precarious existences living under capitalism, with a small number of influential drag queens using their art form to explicitly oppose it. In this chapter, I argue that Drag Race has been made successful for two reasons. Its ability to exploit the particular ways that the internet has networked queer people who had been previously dispersed around the globe into a monetizable audience. And secondly, by recasting drag as a neoliberal enterprise. Most Drag Race queens now refer to their personae as brands, and the most successful of these tend to draw on aesthetics that hyperbolized the sexualized beauty ideals of post-feminist media cultures. You can see this in Courtney Act on the slide. Drag then has only become successful in the mainstream during the post-2008 conjuncture on the condition that it uses digital tools to refashion itself in accordance with neoliberal norms, almost entirely neutering its once oppositional edge. And actually, it turns out, offering very little in material gain for most of the drag queens who do this. So if the first three case studies offer examples of men using neoliberal means to create value, then the final case study gives us a glimpse of how digital media might be used to perhaps not resist neoliberalism, but at least offer some reprieve from it. This chapter takes chemsex as its subject. Chemsex is a term used to describe group sex encounters between gay and bisexual men, mostly organized through hookup apps in which particular recreational drugs are consumed. Against moral panic interpretations that claim chemsex has arisen out of gay men's alleged greater capacities for self-destructive behavior, I instead argue that it has emerged in London as a response to the effect of neoliberalism on gay life in the city. Firstly, in the gentrification that has caused a 58% reduction of material spaces where LGBTQ plus folk can collectively gather. And secondly, in the privatized, individualized, and consumer-based subjectivities that queer people have been encouraged to adopt. What chemsex offers men is a form of intensely felt collectivity in ideological and material conditions that work against this very thing. Okay, so to put the meat on the bones of this argument, what I'm going to do now in the final part of this talk is drill down into my first case study, the Celebrity Male Nude Leak, or when a full frontal image of a male celebrity is leaked over the internet at a time that appears to coincide with either the launch of a commodity the celebrity is promoting, or immediately after a PR crisis, or sometimes both. So the phenomenon, as I understand it, really began with R&B singer Chris Brown in early 2011. Between 2009 and 2011, Brown had been persona non grata in the entertainment industry as a result of him attacking his then girlfriend Rihanna so severely that she had to be hospitalized. Despite some crisis management PR, the public backlash against Chris Brown was so overwhelming, his career as a pop star seemed to be over. That was until this image was leaked via hip hop website worldstarhiphop.com, accompanied by the text. One of Chris Brown's ex-chicks drops off and leaks Breezy's Chris Brown's nickname, Breezy's bathroom sexting pics. It's not clear if the girl is planning to drop any more. Brown's new album Fame is due to be released on March the 22nd. So this leaked image generated a wealth of online commentary, both from celebrity gossip journalists and social media users. Some pointed out how close the leak was to the album release date. Celebrity gossip website MediaTakeout.com wrote, Chris Brown is doing everything to try and revive his career. His single, Look at Me Now, was released 6 days later after the image leaked. The album Fame was released a week later, reaching #1 on both the Billboard 100 and R&B charts, eventually becoming a twice platinum selling album. And shortly after, Chris Brown returned to his pre-2009 levels of success. Although it's impossible to say with absolute certainty, everything around the leaked image suggests that it was strategically leaked in a bid to rehabilitate Chris Brown's music career. And even if the leak was not deliberate, it clearly contributed to the rebranding of Chris Brown from music industry pariah back into the successful R&B star that he had been until February 2009. Since then, the Celebrity Male Nude League has become a notable feature of celebrity culture. So this slide shows all the leaks reported on by popular gay website Cocktails and Cock Talk between 2016 and June 2018, when I was doing the research for the chapter. This includes a range of celebrities, from global megastars such as Justin Bieber and Orlando Bloom, to a host of reality TV participants for whom it seems the Nude League has almost become an essential step in attempting to launch their celebrity career. What is interesting about these leaks are the ways they make the nude male body visible within popular culture, and for the value that they create as a result. As I've already explained, the fully naked male body has been all but invisible in Western culture, particularly in comparison to the naked female body, and has therefore been comparatively resistant to modern capitalism's commodifying drives. In the celebrity male nude leak, we are seeing the visibility of the nude male body increase in ways that create value for a whole range of different parties within the entertainment industries. For the companies whose the product the leak coincides with, for the celebrities themselves, and for the media outlets who report on them. How do we account for this? To begin to answer this question, it's worth returning to Richard Dyer's groundbreaking work on the construction of stardom. In this, Dyer argues that stardom is dependent on the slow bleed of apparently private information about a Hollywood actor into the public realm via paratexts like magazines and gossip columns. Little else is considered little else is considered as private as a person's naked body, and this is what gives the publication of celebrity nudes their specific cultural power. To be more precise, it has been the publication of female celebrity nudes that has had a specific cultural power. In 2006, Adam Nee argued that the overwhelming amount of celebrity nudes were of female celebrities, pointing to the high commercial valuation and paradoxically low cultural status of the female body in Hollywood and the entertainment industries more widely. Now, this is entirely in line with the mind-body dynamics I outlined at the beginning of this talk, in which modernity-subordinated groups have had their bodies put to work so value can be extracted from them. Now, the emergence of the celebrity male nude league therefore represents a significant shift in the gendered logics of celebrity nudity. This shift, I argue, has come about as a result of the historical processes that have come to define the post-2008 conjuncture. The widespread availability of digital technologies and the role they have played in propping up neoliberal capitalism, not only as an economic system and the material conditions it produces, but also as a hegemonic project working across multiple fronts, including our subjectivities, intimate lives, and gendered modes of embodiment. How this plays out in the context of the celebrity male nude is as follows. So the majority of the nude leaks come from men working in the reality television sector. So from UK shows like Geordie Shore, The Only Way is Essex, and Love Island. This is the most highly neoliberalized sector of the entertainment industry. In fact, Alison Hearn has argued that reality television is best understood not as a genre of television, because for one thing, there are too many styles of TV that go by the name reality television, but as a set of cost-cutting measures that have been introduced to make certain television shows and franchises more competitive in the global marketplace. One of the key reasons reality television has been successful within the industry is precisely because it does not employ highly paid, unionized actors, instead relying on competitors in talent shows or real people in their everyday lives. These participants work with no union representation, few labour rights, sometimes no contracts, and with little or no pay. They are employed, in inverted commas, on the basis that reality television will provide them with a platform to build a brand through which they can market their entrepreneurial activities, things like magazine deals, nightclub appearances, and so on. In this sense, participation in reality television exemplifies the sort of neoliberalism that has come to dominate the post-2008 conjuncture. Precarious employment conditions where freelancers are encouraged to think of themselves as entrepreneurs competing with each other in a free market. Alison Hearn has also argued that one of the ways reality television participants negotiate these working conditions is by using the technological affordances of social media to self-brand, creating mediated personae out of intimate parts of their everyday lives in order to build an audience over social media platforms so they can promote their various entrepreneurial activities. The Celebrity Male Nude League can be seen as a form of self-branding specific to the post-2008 conjuncture. in which sexualized representations of male bodies are being digitally mediated in accordance with neoliberal logics in order to navigate the precarious conditions that these neoliberal logics have brought about. Alison Hearn does not reflect on the place of sex, gender, or the body in practices of self-branding. So in order to understand how these play out in the context of the Celebrity Male Nude League, I interviewed 6 entertainment professionals so I could get an insight into the role they had from the perspective of people working in the industries. I interviewed 2 celebrity journalists, a social media PR, a television PR, a celebrity media trainer, and a men's magazine editor. And I'm happy to talk about the sample, data collection, etc. in the Q&A afterwards. Most of them made direct connection between the nude leaks and the precarious working conditions of reality television. For example, the following quote comes from the TV PR I interviewed. He says, reality TV is probably the lowest end of the celebrity tree, and they don't really make much money. The only way is Essex are probably paid a day rate of about £75, that low. It's just expensive. They've had to go on strike. They've made their money from personal appearances and magazine deals, but the production company takes a cut of those profits. They're famous, but they're not rich. When it comes to the money, that opens all sorts of avenues. And I ask, so it's feasible to imagine that they know these leaks get them into the press and they can make money out of it? Yes, the young guys who a lot of these pictures involve, they're hunky, they're good looking, they have no problem getting naked, and a lot of the time they're doing this on TV shows, so they wouldn't be upset about these images being there because that's what they've built their brands around. Why not make a bit of money out of it as well? When it came to explaining the choice to sexualize their bodies over other self-branding strategies, all my interviewees pointed to the precedent set by female celebrities like Kim Kardashian and Paris Hilton, who either launched or significantly furthered their celebrity careers after their sex tapes were leaked. The men were either leaking images or remained unbothered by images being leaked because they had seen the effect of the circulation of sexualized representations of female bodies had on the careers of the 2 of the biggest female celebrities in the sector. In the book, I developed the connection between nude leaks as a feminine form of labour and the feminization of labour debates that argue that all labour under neoliberalism resembles, most labour under neoliberalism resembles work historically undertaken by women, with regards to both the poor conditions we labour under and the sorts of work most of us, in the overdeveloped North at least, have to do. Affective labour, semiotic labour, and relational labour. What I think the Celebrity Male Nude League, as well as the other case studies in my book, demonstrates is that we need to add sexualized labour to that list as well. Precisely because of the weakened position that even men have found themselves living under neoliberalism, some men are turning to what has been left available to them in these conditions to create whatever value they can. Neoliberal techniques of self-branding, digital media, and the sexualization of their bodies. Even if it's a practice that only a handful of men can engage in, the Celebrity Male Nude League is instructive in this regard, representing as it does a context that exemplifies not only a form of labour that many people aspire to, but also an especially intensified form of the conditions that more and more of us are living and working under. Okay, so the conclusion. So ultimately what this book is about is how the male body has been opened up as a front in neoliberalism's struggle for hegemony in the post-2008 conjuncture, a site where it has been advanced, negotiated, and almost resisted. To be clear, I'm not claiming that men, working or middle class, have experienced the so-called age of austerity nearly as acutely as women, or indeed other minority groups. This is clearly not the case. What I'm hoping to do is to make a contribution to the ongoing cross-disciplinary conversation that shows how neoliberalism has made life more precarious for everyone except global elites, even social groups who've been relatively well served by earlier forms of capitalism. This can be evidenced not only through access to work, benefits, housing and healthcare, but also in how people, men included, think and act as sexual subjects and the work to which their sexualized bodies are put. I should also be clear that I'm not opposed to the use of digital media to sexualize the body, male, female, trans, non-binary, or otherwise. What the book is a critique of is the way more groups of people feel compelled to sexualize their bodies in line with very narrow beauty ideals in ways that create value for neoliberal capitalism whilst creating very little value for themselves. I end the book considering how digital media and the sexualized body might be used to resist the hegemonic efforts of neoliberalism. And I won't go into these now. I'll only say that if we're interested in moving the current unraveling of neoliberalism towards more progressive futures than those imagined in the age of Brexit, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, and climate change, we will need a top to bottom transformation of the way neoliberalism has insinuated itself, in Joe Littler's words, into every nook and cranny of our social lives. Not only health, housing, and social care, but also our popular cultures, communicative infrastructures, and gendered bodies too. Thank you very much.
So there's one question from Anthony.
Sure.
I don't know if you see it. Yeah.
Should I read it?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think people can see it anyway, but thank you. Hi, Jamie, wondering if you could chat a bit about ethnicity and the kinds of entrepreneurialism you're talking about. E.g., there's a common critique, clap, clap, with RuPaul's Drag Race that the queens of color don't have as much access to fame or money that white queens do, unless they perform particular roles. Yes, so ethnicity is a key factor across the book. And RuPaul's Drag Race is a slight outlier in terms of the argument I'm making. So I'll talk specifically about that. Yeah, I mean, Anthony, that is absolutely true. And as you can see from that slide that I showed you, Courtney Act is one of the more successful queens. A lot of the queens who kind of have reached beyond the 1 million mark on Instagram are white queens. And that, as you say, is a common critique. And it's precisely, so, I mean, in the chapter, I begin by putting kind of Drag Race into context and argue that, you know, drag has, I mean, and this is true in America as much as in the UK, I think perhaps more so in the UK, that drag has historically drawn on a whole repertoire of different aesthetics. So from kind of pantomime and horror, and it wasn't always about, and I think this is surprising perhaps to some younger people, that whose only encounter with drag race is with drag culture is Drag Race. And what happens is in Drag Race is that there's a kind of emphasis on what in Drag Race they call fishiness, which is a highly kind of feminine, kind of beautiful kind of drag, which isn't necessarily a drag culture that exists kind of across America, or certainly in the UK. And whiteness is absolutely a kind of part of that. The more the most successful drag queens in Drag Race are the and not perhaps so much in the show, although I think it's also true of the show, and I think that's something they're trying to address, but also in the afterlife of the show, are the ones who look like, or attempt to kind of hyperbolize, as I say, the kind of the white slender bodies, or to a certain degree, the white kind of curvaceous bodies of post-feminist media cultures. So whether that's the kind of YouTuber beauty people, or whether it's Hollywood stars, or whether it's pornography, whiteness is absolutely central to the success of RuPaul's Drag Race, to the detriment, I think, of a lot of drag's subversive potential, which involved, I mean, you know, you only need to compare it to something like the success of Paris is Burning kind of 20 or 30 years ago, and its enduring legacy, to show different ways that gender nonconformity has been racialized. And what, interestingly, given that RuPaul is a Black queen, that the kind of cultural output is so white. So yes, I agree with you.
Okay, so we have a next question from Karen, I guess, from the host.
Yeah, I don't, you know, I mean, Karen, that, you know, that's a very interesting question. Because certainly as I started doing, I don't like to predict. And also what was quite surprising to me about doing the research for the book was that it really did start off with me researching, thinking, what is happening with all these people posting bodies, well, these men, well, and women, but men particularly in terms of the book, um, of their sexualized bodies on social media. And I think, it was often talked about in the press as just being, because they can, or because of their narcissism. And I just, as you can see, I think something, much more complicated is going on. And I never anticipated in doing the research that I would necessarily kind of connect it to the kind of social forces that I ended up connecting it to. So I think it's very different to, I think it's very difficult to know how the pandemic is going to affect aesthetics. I mean, I'm currently working on a different project which uses a similar kind of conjunctural approach to look at how gay and bisexual men use their smartphones to negotiate their cultures of intimacy. And one of the things I need to do is think about how this which I'm trying to do is to think about how this relates to the wider cultural conditions. And obviously, before a month ago, the wider cultural conditions were very, very different. And one of the things that I'm interested to find out, and obviously, as this is reminding us how in this project, how important the digital will be in the kind of connections in relation to the pandemic. And I think that often, people are unpredictable. So I don't know, but I'm interested. And clearly, in terms of what conjuncture we currently inhabit, the pandemic will obviously play a massive role in reshifting the kind of social, cultural, economic kind of world that we inhabit. So yeah, I'll be interested to know. Okay.
And the Jesper question next.
From Jasper, is there a relationship between self-branding and sexting? Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I haven't looked at young. I haven't looked at sexting per se, and I know that there is research from people like Jessica Ringrose and colleagues that she works with and Kath Aubrey in Australia on sexting. And I think Jessica frames it slightly in relation to neoliberalism and self-branding. I mean, the honest answer is that I haven't done the research. I mean, I'm minded of Sharif Molabokas's work that looks at the way that, particularly on gaydar, the aesthetics, even whether people are promoting themselves in a self-branding way like a celebrity, the aesthetics that people tend to draw on to sexualize their bodies are the aesthetics available to them in kind of consumer culture and pornography culture. So whether young people or adults are sexting or not to self-brand, there is an element of those aesthetics that are circulating. We've now photograph ourselves in very different ways. My photographs of myself when I was 16 are not the same as what 16-year-olds photographs look like now. And so, and I'm also, Carl Bonner Thompson also, I think, looks at the way that men on Grindr use kind of consumer aesthetics to represent their bodies. So in that respect, I imagine that these kind of neoliberal consumer logics are shaping modes of self-representation, whether they're actually used to promote a kind of self as brand or not. So yeah, hopefully I can do that. I hope that answers your question. Okay.
And Claire.
Oh, thank you, Claire. I wonder about the role of...
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question about the pleasure, but yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, in any sensory body's experience of the mental these practices always recuperated of this talk connection. Oh, thank you, Claire. So pleasure is an enormously important part of this book. And it comes out mostly in, well, I mean, I get pleasure from from participating in different ways in these cultures, but in terms of the spawn of sexual and in terms of chemsex, I spoke in both of those chapters to men who engaged in posting images of their sexualized bodies and to men who engaged in chemsex. And the theoretical frame that I used is a Deleuze-Guattarian one. So I use a slightly different kind of affective terminology to pleasure. They use kind of questions of joy and sadness. They draw on Spinoza's ideas of affect. and that joy is an increase in a person's capacity to act, and sadness is a decrease in a person's capacity to act. So, I mean, to be very specific about it, and there are debates within certain parts of French critical theory that pleasure is different to desire and pleasure is different to joy. I use that framework. And in both, they were always mixed. And I understood, so there was always pleasure. But I mean, obviously, I say obviously, but in chemsex, sexualized drug use clearly produces pleasure. And as I said in the talk, the pleasure of for men of having their bodies kind of commented on and shared. But these were always, in both cases, I talk about the affective contradictions. They were always kind of folded into more sad affects. And I read the particular kind of the very specific contradictions produced by both cultural practices as a response to the historical conditions they live in. So, for example, the chemsex, I argue, the mix of kind of the intense sexual pleasure that people get, and then the other kind of more sad affects, kind of the come downs and the kind of not feeling quite connected, and it was always mixed, was, I argued, a result of the desire for these gay men to feel collective pleasure in historical conditions which, you know, try to isolate and atomize us. And so, yes, pleasure does play a role, but it's always mixed in complicated ways with kind of non-pleasurable affects, and that's part of the historical kind of circumstances we find ourselves in.
Okay, and the next is from Wing.
Yes, Faye, I know Faye. Hey, Faye, your book focuses on mobility. It has been transit. Yes, do you think the need to turn in drag culture can, in fact, destabilize gender identities, or is it only about value generation through capitalizing on maleness? Is this why you quite an outlier? Yeah, okay. So, yes, I had to be very careful about how I framed the research on RuPaul's Drag Race as a male body practice. And that was because the show, frames it as such. So up until a certain point, because I think anybody that knows Drag Race knows there was a controversy around RuPaul's decision to include trans women who were drag queens in the show, where he claimed that he wouldn't, there were certain types of trans bodies that he wouldn't include, which was completely ridiculous because a load of trans women had taken part in the show already at different stages of transition and with different relationships to what kind of transitioning meant to them. So to be clear, in the chapter, I think that, I mean, yeah, I kind of understand what you're saying. I mean, I think I'm excited and have always been excited by the subversive potential of drag, not only to kind of hegemonic versions of gender, but also to capitalism. And there's, one example I can think of that does both very kind of well is the 1960s and 70s drag troupe, the kind of Coquettes. And that has certain legacies, who are an anti-capitalist kind of, mixed collective of kind of gender nonconformists, and that has a long legacy of unsettling kind of dominant relationships. So there are people like David Hoyle, who's sometimes called the Divine David in the UK, Vaginal Cream Davis, who a lot of queer theorists have written about, who do this. So it's Drag Race in particular. And I think there are interesting, queens within Drag Race and things outside of Drag Race, but I'm looking at the kind of central tendencies within Drag Race. So yes, I do think that drag culture and even some elements of Drag Race can destabilize gender identity and aren't only about gender, only about value generation. But mostly, I think Drag Race is that. And I'm continuously interested in the different kind of cultural productions around non-to-gen conformity and the growth of that recently, the growth of that in relation to digital media, kind of around trans politics, around kind of, Tumblr cultures, around gender non-conformity that do what you say. So yeah, okay.
And Sophie.
Yeah. Hey, Sophie, I actually quote you in my chapter on Drag Race. So I'm wondering about your analysis of comics read. I'm wondering how your reading of aesthetic labor maps onto this, especially as young women who participate in this focus on every day. Could you explicitly seen as well? Yeah. So yes, I mean, Sophie, interestingly, I speak to your research on this, and the work that you did. I think it's on not Deliciously Ella. Sorry, that's I forget her name now. The woman that I showed, where you talk about I think it's something like the performative happiness of these people, masking the kind of deep anxiety and deep insecurity that comes with trying to live up to the kind of beauty ideals. Zoella, yeah, thank you, Sophie. Yeah, hopefully I've characterized your argument correctly. And yeah, there is a difference here with the drag race, particularly. So I look at the body transformation tutorials, and as is common with drag performance, even the ones that, and again, it's an ambivalent reading that I give of this, is that even the ones that most straightforwardly present a kind of fishy style of drag, or a kind of more normative idea of what a woman should look like, there is always a degree of exaggeration with drag, always. I can't think off the top of my head. There's a couple of drag queens on Drag Race who look kind of natural and could pass, whatever that means. And it's for drag race queens, it's for those, there's always, not only is the style completely exaggerated, but often they're cracking jokes, right? I mean, these queens are used to standing in bars and kind of doing kind of performances, which more often than not involved in comedy. So there's always, and this speaks to a couple of other questions about Drag Race. So there's always a subversive element to the performances of when they are creating their kind of feminine looks, which clearly isn't the case with someone like Zoella. So what was your question? Yeah, and the other thing that I think I haven't realised is I've given this talk a couple of times, or versions of this talk about Drag Race a couple of times, and a lot of women in the audience will say that their teenage children are using techniques from the Drag Race tutorials for themselves. So apparently contouring is a much more kind of common thing, or the very exaggerated sort of contouring that Drag Race women do. So yeah, I think there's an interesting relationship, and I don't think I fully unpacked it, but there is, I mean, clearly there is an interesting relationship between the more everyday young women following people like Zoella and then Drag Race. And I've done a bit of work unpacking that. There's more of that in the book. Hopefully I've answered that question. Yay.
And there's a question from Hong as well.
Yes, hey Hongwei, hi. Reading your book, you talk about how sex bodies can be used collectively and for, okay, right. So this goes to the concluding chapter of my book, which I didn't talk to. And it's quite theoretical, and I'm not sure how much time I've got to kind of unpack it, and my brain is a little bit frazzled, so I'm not sure I'm going to do it justice. But I make at the end of my talk, I made the distinction between sexual bodies and digital media, and that I'm not opposed to that. What I'm opposed to is the way that in our current conjuncture, more people are kind of making their bodies, working on their bodies to make them look in line with certain very narrow beauty ideals in ways that create money for neoliberal capitalism. And so I'm thinking about other ways that sexualized bodies might kind of change that. I use Deleuze and Guattari's idea of becoming imperceptible. So in creating kind of affective intensities in ways that make bodies or dissolve kind of make bodies imperceptible to capitalism's apparatuses of capture. So these are Deleuze and Guattarian terms, and I know not everybody's a big fan of Deleuze and Guattari, and I'm perhaps not going to have time to unpack that now. But one of the examples that I use in the book is chemsex, which was the last chapter, which it involves what you're talking about Grindr and the sharing of sexualized bodies. And I talk about chemsex sessions, which are men using Grindr, mostly Grindr and other hookup apps, to organize collective sexual encounters, very intense collective sexual encounters that can often last for hours, if not days, as a way of using sex to develop a sense of collectivity. And it's not, and one thing that came out of the interviews that when those drugs are taken, it isn't necessarily about how you look. It's not necessarily about how you fit into existing kind of beauty ideals. It's about the kind of sexualized body as a way of kind of creating connection between groups of people. And this is opposed to the kind of more homonormative, consumer-based, individualist body the neoliberal gay cultures are. So that's one way of doing it. It's not about how beautiful you look and how much money that might make for platforms or for yourself. It's about creating kind of Hello?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, I thought Peter was going to speak. No, okay, yeah, that's so I've answered Hong's question. Yeah.
And on this note, I'm afraid it's at least in Sydney, it's 6 p.m. and we have to wrap up. So let me just thanks Jamie one more time for this terrific talk, which I think everyone enjoyed very much. And yeah, and that's all, I guess. And we virtually all clap as well. Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks both. Thanks, Kerry, and thanks, Petra, and thank everyone.